Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I am Eric, and we are all about unconventional commander decks. Today I want to look at Trelasarra Moondancer from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. Trelasarra is a 2/2 elf cleric that costs green-white, and it says whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on Trelasarra Moondancer and scry 1. And also, nope, that's it. That's all Trelasarra does. Trelasarra is basically Ajani's Pridemate with a little bit of additional text and a more restrictive mana cost. Or perhaps you could say it's like Uncle Karlov, but it grows at half the rate, and it gives you card filtering instead of creature removal. Let's be honest, Trelasarra is not all that great, or unique, but it does have a few strong points. First, it's only 2 mana. Our commander can come down fast and start generating value right away. And when it gets big, our opponents might be hesitant to remove it unless it's absolutely necessary, or they've just got an excess of removal, since we can just recast it for 4 mana. Secondly, this is obviously a lifegain deck. This is a well-established theme with a lot of support, and Trelasarra cares about the instances of lifegain that we get, not so much how big those lifegain triggers are. And there are many cards that can provide us with a little bit of life in small and very numerous packets, like Life Gift, which gains us 1 life whenever a land enters the battlefield, even for our opponents, or of course the Soul Sisters, which gain us 1 life whenever a creature enters the battlefield, and again this counts token creatures and creatures our opponents control as well when our opponents have creatures enter the battlefield. So cards like this give us a lot of little life gain triggers, which means lots of +1/+1 counters on Trelasarra and lots of scrying. And scry 1 might not be all that great, but if you can do it 20 times in a game, or 50 times, that's actually deceptively good. You'll much more reliably hit your land drops, and you won't draw dead cards. Scrying this much will make your deck run very reliably, and it's very reasonable to do this when we have lots of life gain triggers that we can get in this deck. But this scry ability is also not so good that your opponents will feel pressured to remove Trelasarra. So I like Trelasarra here because she provides good value if you can keep her on the battlefield for a while, but again that value is not quite good enough that our opponents will feel like they have to deal with Trelasarra right away. So normally this is the part of the video where I would describe the deck strategy. What strategy will we be using? What pieces do we need to generate value or destroy our opponents? But Trelasarra is a pretty straightforward life gain themed deck. There are tons of cards in Magic that support a life gain theme, so I've made some very specific and intentional selections for cards that will make it into the 99, but overall this deck is very simple. We're going to gain some life, we'll use that life as a resource to generate advantage, or even win the game if possible, and we'll also make Trelasarra really big in the process, and we might be able to use that to our advantage too. So let's go over the cards that are in this deck, starting with the most valuable life gain pieces. Now again, we want as many life gain triggers as we can possibly generate in this deck. We don't care how much life we gain, we only care about how many times we gain life. Essence Warden, Soul Warden, Soul's Attendant, all of these are 1 mana 1/1s that gain us 1 life whenever any other creature enters the battlefield. I've chosen these 3 because they're the most efficient, but there are plenty of other creatures like them. There's Suture Priest, for example. But Suture Priest only gains us life whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control. When an opponent has a creature enter the battlefield under their control, instead, they lose 1 life. Now this is just fine, but it's not as synergistic with our commander, and it costs 2 mana, so I didn't include Suture Priest. There's Ajani's Welcome, which also only triggers when a creature enters the battlefield under our control, but it's also only 1 mana and it's an enchantment, so it's harder to remove, so I did include this one. Sunscorched Regent is a removal magnet, but it will do some work as long as it exists. It's a 5 mana 4/3 dragon that causes you to gain 1 life whenever opponent casts a spell, any spell. It also gets a +1/+1 counter when this happens. So just like your commander, Sunscorched Regent gets really big, really fast. There's Wolverine Riders. This is a 6 mana 4/4 that has you create a 1/1 green elf creature token at the beginning of each upkeep, that includes your opponent's upkeeps, and whenever an elf enters the battlefield under your control, you gain life equal to its toughness. So in a normal 4-player game of Commander, this guy gives you 4 life gain triggers for each round of the table for 0 additional investment beyond casting it, and it fills your board with blockers. And that's it. I mean, these are the cards that give us the greatest quantity of life gain triggers, but there are lots of other cards in the deck that will gain life for us. Let's talk about some of the ways that we can fit as many life gain triggers into this deck as possible. Now, one of the coolest parts, I think, about deck construction is picking out the synergistic cards to fill the deck's basic functions, like card draw, ramp, and removal. We could play Cultivate, for example, but in this deck I'd rather play Pristine Talisman. This is a 3-mana artifact that taps for colorless, and you gain 1 life. Pristine Talisman is a very mediocre card, but in this game it also puts a +1/+1 counter on your commander and gives you a Scry 1 every time you tap it, so that's decent. Speaking of ramp, we'll also use Verdant Haven and Gift of Paradise. These are both 3-mana auras that enchant a land, and they let that land tap for 2 mana instead of 1, and they also gain you a little bit of life when they enter the battlefield. Now, we don't have any enchantment synergies in this deck, but these cards are still very effective and synergistic ramp pieces that we can use in this deck. Okay, now I've got one more for you. Have you heard of Environmental Sciences? This is a fairly new one from Strixhaven. It's a sorcery, a lesson, which we don't care about. It costs 2 colorless mana, and you get to search your library for a basic land and put it into your hand, and you gain 2 life. Now, this isn't even mana ramp, it's just mana fixing, but it will help us make our land drops, and it will trigger all of our life gain synergies. I included this in the deck, though admittedly, it just barely makes the cut. It's not that great. We'll also try to generate life gain triggers as much as we can when we draw cards. Selvala, Explorer Returned is an obvious inclusion. She can tap and have each player reveal the top card of their library. For each non-land card revealed this way, we add green and gain 1 life. Then each player draws a card. Selvala is dumb, and we're not abusing Selvala in this deck by repeatedly untapping her and tapping her again, but we definitely will appreciate the free life gain and card draw. There's Dawn of Hope. This is a life gain deck staple. It's a 2-mana enchantment that lets us pay 2 whenever we gain life, and if we do, we draw a card. But we can also pay 3 and a white to make a 1/1 white soldier creature token with lifelink, so Dawn of Hope can help us gain life too. What about Mazemind Tome? This is a limited use card draw artifact. It costs 2 and you can tap it and put a tome counter on it and scry 1. Or you can pay 2 and tap it and put a tome counter on it and draw a card. And when Mazemind Tome has 4 tome counters on it, you exile it and gain 4 life. So over its lifetime, Mazemind Tome will cost us 8 mana to draw 4 cards and gain 4 life, which is not terribly exciting, but we can make those payments in very reasonable installments, and again it's card draw and life gain all in one. We'll play Scale the Heights. This is a single-use effect, but it does everything we want. It's a 3-mana sorcery that puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature. You also gain 2 life, and you may play an additional land this turn, and you draw a card. I wouldn't technically classify this as card draw since it only replaces itself, but it's a nice little value card. And then we'll use Survival Cache. This is another 3-mana sorcery. You gain 2 life. Then if you have more life than an opponent, and you should, then you draw a card. And it has rebound, so you'll get to cast it again during your next upkeep. And we'll also try to incorporate life gain into our removal cards as much as is reasonable. Now, I couldn't quite justify including Invoke the Divine as, a naturalize that costs 1 more mana but also gains us 4 life, but I will definitely play Pest Infestation. This is great. This is another newish one from the Strixhaven Commander set. It's XX and green for a sorcery that destroys X target artifacts and/or enchantments, and you create twice X 1/1 pest creature tokens that have, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. So this is already great at wiping out several problem artifacts and enchantments, but you also create a bunch of delayed life gain triggers from those pest tokens. Similarly, we'll play Heliod's Intervention. This is white and X for an instant. Choose 1, destroy X target artifacts or enchantments, or target player gains X life. Now, unlike Pest Infestation, Heliod's Intervention will only destroy permanents or gain life, not both, but it's also an instant instead of a sorcery, and it generally costs less to destroy artifacts and enchantments with Heliod's Intervention than it does with Pest Infestation. Now, I also really like to include some graveyard hate in my decks, so I've included Scavenging Ooze. This is a 2-mana 2/2 that lets you pay green to exile a card from a graveyard. If that card was a creature card, you gain 1 life and put a counter, a +1/+1 counter on Scavenging Ooze. There's Ashes of the Abhorrent. This is a 2-mana enchantment that says players can't cast spells from graveyards or activate abilities of cards in graveyards, but it also says whenever a creature dies, you gain 1 life. Fracturing Gust, sorcery, 5 mana, 2 and 3 Selesnya, destroys all artifacts and enchantments, you gain 2 life for each permanent destroyed this way. I've even included Fumigate, a 5 mana sorcery that destroys all creatures and you gain 1 life for each creature destroyed this way. Note that this will destroy your commander too, and you won't get the +1/+1 counter or the scry from the life gain. So there's a bunch of stuff we can play in this deck that just fits what we need to be doing, drawing cards, ramping, and so forth, and we'll just gain more life in the process, triggering our commander. Blossoming Sands and Greypelt Refuge are budget green-white dual lands that enter tapped, and you gain 1 life when they enter the battlefield. There's Sapseep Forest. This is a non-basic forest. It also enters tapped, taps for green, and you can also pay green and tap it to gain 1 life, but you can only activate this ability if you control 2 or more green permanents. And finally, we'll play Witch's Clinic. This taps for colorless, but we can also pay 2 and tap it to have target commander gain lifelink until end of turn. Since Trelasarra can get very, very big, Witch's Clinic can generate a lot of life gain for us, though it will typically only generate a single life gain trigger at a time. So we have lots of cards in this deck that gain us life. And I haven't mentioned all of them yet. Let's talk about how we can take advantage of that life gain. So our commander gets bigger and lets us scry when we gain life, but there are lots of other ways that we can generate value from life gain. A Trudge Garden, for example, is a 3-mana enchantment that lets us pay 2 whenever we gain life to create a 4/4 Fungus Beast creature token with trample. There's Attended Healer. This is a very unassuming 4-mana 2/3 cleric that has, whenever you gain life for the first time each turn, create a 1/1 white cat creature token. So with some work, you could make up to 4 token creatures for each round of the table in a 4-player game if you manage to gain life on each of your opponent's turns and on your turn. But Attended Healer also has pay 2 and a white, another target cleric gains lifelink until end of turn. And Trelasarra just happens to be a cleric that can get really, really big, so Attended Healer can help us gain a bunch of life, while also generating tokens for us whenever we gain life. There's Valkyrie Harbinger. This is a 6-mana 4/5 angel that has flying and lifelink, and at the beginning of each end step, if you gain 4 or more life this turn, create a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying and vigilance. Notice that's each end step. Now we won't always be able to gain 4 life on every player's turn, but Valkyrie Harbinger will still absolutely take over the game if it isn't answered quickly. Then there's another new one from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. That's the Book of Exalted Deeds. This is an artifact that costs white, white, white. It has, at the beginning of your end step, if you gain 3 or more life this turn, create a 3/3 white angel creature token with flying, but it also has pay white, 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 tap and exile the Book of Exalted Deeds to put an enlightened counter on target angel. It gains you can't lose the game, and your opponents can't win the game. Activate only as a sorcery. So this is a life gain payoff that can completely stall our opponent's plans to win, as long as we can keep that enlightened angel creature on the battlefield. Now, as long as we're gaining a bunch of life, we also want to be able to use that life as a resource. Now, the most obvious outlet for a high life total is Aetherflux Reservoir, which lets us pay 50 life to deal 50 damage to any target. This card is infamous in Commander in any deck that's gaining any amount of life, or any Storm deck as well, but there are also cards like Felidar Sovereign and Test of Endurance, which let us win the game at the beginning of our upkeep if we have at least 40 or 50 life respectively. I chose not to include Felidar Sovereign or Test of Endurance, since they'll definitely result in the rest of the table teaming up against you, but you could include them, they make sense in this deck. Now I did include Angel of Destiny. This is a 2/6 angel with flying and double strike that costs 3 white white. It has whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you and that player each gain that much life. It also has at the beginning of your end step, if you have at least 15 more life than your starting life total, each player Angel of Destiny attacks this turn loses the game. Now, anytime a card has the word player, loses, and game somewhere in the text, your opponents will pay attention. So I wouldn't cast this card unless you're ready to deal with the combined ire of the table. But as long as you can maintain a high life total, at least 55, then all you need to do is attack a player with Angel of Destiny, and that player will lose the game at the end of your turn. Oh, and Angel of Destiny has to stay alive until then too. I mean, it probably won't, but if it does, great. And we'll use Righteous Aura. This is a 2-mana enchantment that lets you pay white and 2 life to prevent all damage that would be dealt to you from a single source. As easily as we can gain life in this deck, Righteous Aura makes it very hard for our opponents to kill us unless they can remove it first. Now, I also like Sylvan Library. This is already a really good card. If you're playing green, you probably already should be playing Sylvan Library if it's within your budget. It's an enchantment that costs 1 and a green and $40. And it says at the beginning of your draw step, you may draw an additional 2 cards. If you do, choose 2 cards in your hand drawn this turn. For each of those cards, pay 4 life or put the card on top of your library. Again, Sylvan Library is already really good, but with all of our life gain, we'll have an easier time paying that 8 life each turn so that we essentially draw 3 cards during our draw step instead of just 1, so this is great. But one of my favorite life gain payoffs is Phyrexian Processor. Now, this is an artifact that costs 4 mana. When it enters the battlefield, you can pay any amount of life, and then you can pay 4 and tap it to put an XX black minion creature token onto the battlefield, where X is the amount of life you paid. You could easily pay 20 or much more life in this deck to generate a massive creature token each turn for just 4 mana. Now that token won't have any evasion, but we have solutions for that, which we'll talk about soon. There's the new enchantment, a Cleric class, that says if you would gain life, you gain that much life plus 1 instead. Now this will help us gain more life, but it won't generate more life gain triggers. Now we can also pay 3 and a white to level up this enchantment to level 2, and when we do, Cleric class also gains, whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So this mimics our commander's ability and can basically turn any other creature into half of Trelasarra, or just double the rate at which Trelasarra grows. And then finally we can level up Cleric class to level 3 by paying 4 and a white, and when you do, you return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, then gain life equal to its toughness. So you really want to level up Cleric class to at least level 2 to basically duplicate your commander's ability to generate +1/+1 counters, in addition to making all of your life gain triggers a little bit bigger. But that single-use reanimation effect at level 3 can of course be useful too. But this deck isn't just about gaining life, we're also making our commander really big. Now let's talk about some of the ways that we can take advantage of having a really large creature. Now we mentioned that Cleric class, for example, basically replicates our commander's ability to generate +1/+1 counters whenever you gain life, but there are plenty of other creatures that have this effect as well, and we'll include a few but not all of them here for redundancy. Ajani's Pridemate and Gideon's Company get +1/+1 counters whenever you gain life. The Pridemate gets a single counter, while Gideon's Company gets 2 counters every time you gain life. And then there's Ajani's Strength of the Pride. This is a 4-mana 5 loyalty planeswalker that makes Ajani's Pridemates with its -2 ability. It also has a +1 that can gain us life equal to the number of creatures we control. Of course, we'll play Archangel of Thune, which puts a +1/+1 counter on all of our creatures whenever we gain life. Our deck isn't particularly going wide and generating a bunch of creatures, at least most of the time, but Archangel of Thune will absolutely still end games if it isn't removed quickly. And of course we'll play Heliod Suncrowned, which lets us put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or enchantment you control whenever you gain life. It also lets you pay 1 and a white to give another target creature you control lifelink until end of turn, so it helps you gain life too. It's also a 5/5 indestructible god. Heliod is good. I don't think I need to further justify its inclusion in this deck. So these creatures are all redundancies for our commander that can get really big as we gain life. But those creatures don't have trample or evasion, except for Archangel of Thune, which has flying, so we will need some way to get them in for combat damage. There's plenty of auras and equipments that can easily turn a giant vanilla Ajani's Pridemate into an existential threat. Shadow Spear, Loxodon Warhammer, for example, give the equipped creature lifelink and trample. But here's the thing, when you have a 30/30 Ajani's Pridemate and you cast Loxodon Warhammer, your opponents will pay attention. An Ajani's Pridemate without the Warhammer can be chump blocked all day. A Pridemate equipped with the Warhammer is basically called player removal. Even though this is a Selesnya deck, and Selesnya decks are known for deploying big and obvious threats, I still prefer to be subtle, so I've chosen single-use buffs for my really large creatures that won't set my opponents on alert until the very last moment. And even though these are single-use cards, that's fine, because when you're attacking with a 40/40 with trample, you really only need to do that once. Berserk is easily the most effective option here. This is a 1-mana instant that can only be cast before the combat damage step. It has target creature gain trample and get +X+0 until end of turn, where X is its power. At the beginning of the next end step, destroy that creature if it attacked this turn. So this card is amazing. It doubles the power of whatever we target for a single mana, and it gives trample. Even though the creature will die at the end of the turn, most of the time, again, this is going to be boosting one of our creatures to 30 or 40 or power or more, and our opponents will be dead, or at least one of them. And because this is an instant, I can cast it at the very last possible moment, so my opponents have very little time to respond. Of course, you can also cast Berserk on your opponent's creatures too, which can be hilarious. We'll also use Vigorous Charge. This is an instant that costs green. It has target creature gain trample until end of turn. It also has Kicker for white, and if you paid the Kicker cost, then whenever that creature deals combat damage at this turn, you also gain that much life. So this is another really low-cost trample enabler that we can use at the last possible moment, and it can also gain us a bunch of life. We'll also play Akroma's Will. This costs 3 and a white, and you choose one, or if you control a commander as you cast the spell, you may choose both. Creatures you control gain Flying, Vigilance, and Double Strike until end of turn, or creatures you control gain Lifelink, Indestructible, and Protection from all colors until end of turn. Now, this card is amazingly flexible. The first card makes our creatures somewhat evasive and doubles their combat damage. The second mode can gain us a bunch of life, protect our creatures, and make them pretty much unblockable. Akroma's Will ends games. But my favorite way to get our creatures in for damage doesn't actually require them to attack at all. Sure Strike Trident is an equipment that costs 2 and equips for 4. It gives the equipped creature first strike, and tap unattached Sure Strike Trident. This creature deals damage equal to its power to target player. Again, our creatures like Trelasarra can get massive in this deck. Sure Strike Trident lets them bypass the combat step and deal all that damage directly to an opponent. And it's a pretty reasonable cost of 6 total mana to cast and equip this thing, and yet Sure Strike Trident sees play in fewer than 1,000 decks on EDHREC, which is a little puzzling to me. I mean, any deck with really big creatures should want this equipment. I also like the new, unassuming uncommon from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, Wild Shape. This costs green, it's an instant, and it says choose one. Until end of turn, target creature you control has that base power and toughness, becomes that creature type, and gains that ability. So you're going to choose to make your target creature either a 1/3 turtle with hexproof, a 1/5 spider with reach, or a 3/3 elephant with trample. So Wild Shape is actually deceptively useful here. It's just 1 mana to protect our creature from targeted removal with the first mode by giving it hexproof, or get in for massive combat damage by giving it trample with the third mode. This sort of has the versatility of Akroma's Will, but it only costs a single mana. We'll also use instants to protect our creatures. Again, our creatures like Trelasarra will get really big, like easily double digits at power and toughness big, like easily one-hit kill commander damage big. And our opponents will notice this. But again, all of those creatures are vanilla, they have no evasion. But because our creatures are so big, we can't just expect to plop down some equipment like Swiftfoot Boots and then have our opponents say, okay, cool. So rather than generate unnecessary attention from the table, I prefer that my protection, just like my buffs, come as a surprise to my opponents. So again, they have as little time as possible to do something about it. So I'll use protective spells like Blacksmith's Skill, Emerge Unscathed, and Apostle's Blessing. These are all low mana cost instant spells that will protect my big creatures from targeted removal. Blacksmith's Skill in particular is very nice. It's a 1 white mana heroic intervention for a single creature. It gives target creature hexproof and indestructible until end of turn, and if it's an artifact creature, it also gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Now in this deck, it is not an artifact creature, but that hardly matters. Emerge Unscathed, it is a single white mana to give target creature you control protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. I like this because that protection can basically counter a removal spell, or it can effectively give a creature unblockable until end of turn. At least that creature will be unblockable by creatures of the color of your choice. And it even has rebound, so you can use Emerge Unscathed to protect your creature from targeted removal. Then when it rebounds during your next upkeep, you can use it to make that creature unblockable by creatures of that color of your choice. And then we've got Apostle's Blessing. This is similar. It's 1 and a Phyrexian white mana, so you can pay 1 generic and 2 life if you want to cast it. Then it gives target creature or artifact you control protection from artifacts or from the color of your choice until end of turn. So these are all low mana cost instants that protect one of our big creatures and possibly help us get in for combat damage too. But we've got a few other ways to gain value from having large creatures. Momentous Fall is an instant that costs 2 green. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature. You draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power, then you gain life equal to its toughness. Again, this will easily let you draw 10 or 15 or 20 cards, not to mention gaining that much life. And for a similar effect, of course, we'll play Greater Good. This is an enchantment that costs 2 green, and it lets you sacrifice a creature to draw cards equal to its power, and then discard 3 cards. Again, the card advantage here is stupid. I think Reliquary Tower is overplayed. It's really only needed if your deck draws a bunch of cards. But because we're using Momentous Fall and Greater Good, I've chosen to include it in this deck because we're going to be drawing way more than the hand size limit with these cards. Now there's also Monstrous Onslaught. This is a sorcery that costs 3 green. It deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control as you cast this spell. So this can be a one-sided board wipe if your commander or any other similar creature is big enough. A Monstrous Onslaught can clear out blockers to let you get in for combat damage. And notice that the damage it deals, X, is equal to the greatest power among creatures you control as you cast this spell. That means your opponents can't even remove your biggest creature in response while the spell is on the stack, because the value of X is assigned as you cast the spell, not when it resolves. So this is a really awesome board wipe here. And that's most of the deck. I do want to mention a few more cards that I've included to help give our strategy some resilience. We're playing white and green, which is often a very defensive color combination, but unless you're playing stacks, it doesn't really have much control. And this can make us vulnerable to disruption by our opponents. So I've included Conqueror's Flail, Dragonlord Dromoka, and Grand Abolisher to help prevent our opponents from interfering with our plans. Conqueror's Flail is an equipment that costs 2, equips for 2, and gives the equipped creature +1/+1 for each color among permanents you control. Among creatures you control. But it also has, as long as Conqueror's Flail is equipped to a creature, your opponents can't cast spells during your turn. Dragonlord Dromoka also prevents your opponents from casting spells during your turn. It's a 5/7 dragon with flying and lifelink that can't be countered. It costs 4 white-green. So you can cast Dragonlord Dromoka and it will resolve since it can't be countered. Then you can proceed to do whatever else you want with the rest of your mana, and your opponents just have to sit there and watch you do it since they can't cast spells. They can't even remove Dromoka. This is kind of dumb. Actually, I kind of want to build a Dromoka deck now. Anyways, Grand Abolisher does the same thing. It's a 2/2 cleric that costs white, and it says during your turn, your opponents can't cast spells or activate abilities of artifacts, creatures, or enchantments. So this really turns your opponents off from doing anything at all during your turn. And with all of these cards, I'd recommend keeping them in your hand and not casting them until you really need to protect a win condition on the same turn, like Aetherflux Reservoir or Berserk or something like that. And that's the deck. Let's move on to the deck stats and cost. This Trelasarra Moondancer deck has an average mana value of 2.85. We have 34 lands and 18 creatures, so you can see this isn't a really creature-heavy deck. We really just want to make one big creature, whether that's our commander or another redundant creature like Ajani's Pridemate, and then use that big creature to generate advantage for us. There are 38 cards in this deck that give us life gain of some form or another. Some of those are repeatable, like Dawn of Hope or Soul Warden, and some of them are single-use, like Fracturing Gust. There are 13 cards that have some life gain trigger, some cards that do something for us whenever we gain life, like our commander or like cleric class. There's 7 cards that let us pay life for some value, or otherwise take direct advantage of having a lot of life, like Aetherflux Reservoir or Phyrexian Processor. And we've got 7 creatures or effects like our commander that can get really big by getting +1/+1 counters whenever we gain life. Again, like that Cleric class or like Archangel of Thune. And we have 8 cards that can take advantage of having a really big creature, like Momentous Fall or Sure Strike Trident. I'm also counting our spells that grant Trample, like Berserk. And when it comes to staples, we have 9 card draw cards and 9 ramp spells. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $460.36 on tcgplayer.com. I haven't built a budget version of this deck. This deck does have a higher value than what I typically build on this channel, as I'm usually building decks in the $75 to $200 range, just because that fits my playgroup. That said, this Trelasarra deck is fast enough to keep up with higher power level playgroups, but it's unassuming enough that you shouldn't draw a lot of hate from the rest of the table. So I like that balance here. And that is Trelasarra Moondancer. To be fair, this isn't a really unconventional deck by comparison to what I like to build, but I have been wanting to build a life gain deck, and even though we're in Selesnya colors, this deck will allow you to turn your life gain into a weapon. Not as easily as a life gain deck with access to black, perhaps, but we do have options to use life gain as a win condition, with cards like Aetherflux Reservoir or Angel of Destiny. Like I said, I've also tried to make this deck a little more subtle than a conventional Selesnya beatdown deck. Our combat tricks that turn a big Trelasarra or Ajani's Pridemate or whatnot into a one-hit kill are all instant speed and very low mana cost, so again we can cast them at the last possible moment and give our opponents very little time to respond to them. And again, I really like that Trelasarra only costs 2 mana, so she can come in early and start generating value for us. And that Scry 1 every time we gain life is really useful for making the deck perform consistently. But that is it for today. I'm working on a few other deck techs for Adventures in the Forgotten Realm. I'll be posting a deck tech for Cridle of Baldur's Gate, which is another fairly unassuming 2-mana commander that's uncommon, shouldn't get too much attention from your opponents, so you can kind of implement it into your strategy very easily. I'm excited to share a deck that's heavily focused on the new dungeon mechanic. I'm not going to reveal yet which commander or strategy I've chosen for that deck, but I will definitely have one of those coming soon. I'm working on some others as well, but those are the 2 that are sufficiently developed at this point for me to be confident that they'll make it into deck techs. But certainly let me know in the comments if there's any commander or strategy from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms that you'd like to see built into a deck tech, especially an unconventional commander or strategy. But that is all for today. Thank you for watching.